If you want to make money playing poker, probably the most important factor in doing that is finding games where you have a few suckers, fish, donkeys, live ones, or whatever you want to call a bad player. If you're the sixth best poker player in the world, but routinely play against the other 5 guys in the world that are better than you, well, then despite the fact that you're an excellent poker player, you'd still be a sucker to the other 5 players. You'd be the reason that they're playing the game. When you come to places like Las Vegas, or even more so California, the poker capital of the world, you'll usually have a wide variety of games to choose from. At the Commerce Casino in Los Angeles, when you enter the card room, you'll find like a sea of tables with all sorts of different betting limits and varieties of poker. If it's your first time entering a place like this, tip number 1 would be especially important for you. And that tip is, the lower the betting limits, the more likely you are to find suckers. Low-limit games can often be a little bit frustrating to play in, but that's where your edge is the biggest, with lots of novice players learning the game, calling a lot of bets, and making all kinds of foolish mistakes that you just wouldn't find in the high-limit section. In a typical $3 and $6 hold'em game, you'll usually find that a majority of the players aren't very good. You might find, 1 or 2 experienced players in those games tops. The composition of a high-stakes game is much different. If you were to sit down in a 100, 200 hold'em game, you'd be hoping to find 1 or 2 suckers in the game, as the rest of the players, they're probably professionals. Tip number 2. Look for games with lots of loose action. The most common characteristic of a sucker or a bad player is that they just play too many hands. Before taking your seat in the game, watch a few rounds first and see how many players are seeing the flop on a regular basis. The more players that are seeing the flop, the better the game. In a high-stakes game, say 1 in 200 or higher, you'll usually see hands being played heads up or sometimes 3-handed. That's a sure sign that they're looking at a pretty tough table. In a lower-stakes game, it's common to see anywhere from 5 to 8 players seeing the flop almost every hand. Now, you can't really bluff these types of players, but you will actually get excellent value for your good hands, so it makes sense for you to be patient and wait for premium hands. Tip number 3. Look for new faces. A sure sign of a tough lineup is one where you see the same faces day in and day out. It's just way more likely that those players are winning at the game rather than losing. Winning players are able to sustain the ups and downs of the game, while bad players, they often come and go. They either learn quickly and get better, so they're no longer suckers, or they lose too much money and quit playing for a while. Always look for fresh faces, as they are more likely to be bad players than good players. And tip number 4, let's be honest with yourself. Everyone thinks they're a good poker player. Until you realize that you know very little about the game and have to continually learn and improve, you'll always be somebody's sucker. The biggest mistake most players make is that they compare their best game with their opponent's worst game, as in, they remember their opponent's bad plays but neglect to admit that they make mistakes of their own.